Welcome to the Korbel School, and welcome to all of you who are online as we stream this at the same time. I'm Fritz Mayer. I'm the Dean of the Korbel School. It's my honor to moderate today's discussion. You know, we meet 3 days, I guess, after the 20th anniversary of 9/11, and to talk about maybe the first major response to 9/11. America's war in Afghanistan, a conflict, at least for Americans, that spanned nearly 20 years, 4 presidencies, cost thousands of American lives and many other a much larger number of Afghan lives, and multiple billions and arguably trillions of dollars of resources. And that, as we've seen, in the last couple of weeks, and witnessed rather vividly the abrupt and chaotic departure of the United States and the return of the Taliban to power, a group that we thought we had defeated in 2002. It's a return to American consciousness, I think, a war we'd almost forgotten. I mean, the amount of coverage over the last probably decade of what is happening in Afghanistan dwindled and dwindled, and yet now forcefully back in our consciousness. So today we have the opportunity to hear from an extraordinary panel of scholars about the events of last week, to hear about America's experience in Afghanistan and our exit and what we should learn from it, and what the implications are for Afghanistan, for Americans, and for the world. So welcome, delighted to have you. We'll have a conversation amongst ourselves first, and then I think you had the opportunity to suggest questions. We'll try to save some time for questions from the audience as well. So let me introduce our panel, and I'll just go in order of your seating, starting at the far end, as Professor Nazneen Barma, who is the Scribner Chair of Public Policy and Director of the Scribner Institute of Public Policy here at the Korbel School, and Associate Professor at the Korbel School. A political scientist, her work focuses on peace building, foreign aid, and political economy. She's the author of many things, but also, and most relevant, The Peace-Building Puzzle, Political Order in Post-Conflict States. So welcome, Naz. Thanks for being with her. To your left, and next is Professor Andreas Stanton, who is Professor of Islamic Studies and in the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, and the interim director of Korbel's Center for Middle East Studies. Her research focuses on intersections between digital media, personal piety, and state interest in contemporary Islam. So welcome, Andrea. Thanks for being with us today. Next is Professor David Goldfisher, Associate Professor of International Affairs at the Korbel School, who teaches courses on U.S. national security policy. David's also worked on post-9/11 threats as a visiting professor of counterterrorism at National Defense University, as director of the Institute on International and Civil Security in the United Arab Emirates, and as a consultant to U.S. Northern Command and the Department of Homeland Security. David, thanks for being here. And next, Professor Deborah Avant is the C. Chow Kang Chair and Director of the C. Chow Kang Center for International Security and Diplomacy. Her research is focused on many things, but civil-military relations, counterinsurgency, the privatization of security, and non-state actors in governance. Thanks, Debbie, for being here. And last but certainly not least, I'm delighted that we're joined today by Kai Hunter, who is the Director of Strategy and Warfare of the Strategy and Warfare Center at the United States Air Force Academy. She is a United States Marine Corps combat veteran, having served 3 tours in Afghanistan, and proudly for us, a former Sea Fellow and PhD from the Korbel School. Welcome, Kai. Thanks for coming up from the Springs today. So, a lot to cover, and we had a conversation amongst ourselves yesterday and realized this is going to be quite a challenge for me as moderator because there's so much. Well, let me just start with the kind of the big question: what went wrong? And what began as a special forces operation with limited involvement, working with groups in Afghanistan, successfully overthrew the Taliban, morphed into an enormous operation at its peak, 100,000 troops, and as we'll hear, many, many thousands of contractors in place, from an effort to overthrow the Taliban, hopefully to capture bin Laden, to nation building. But we put an enormous amount of effort into this war. And I guess the fundamental question, I'm going to ask you to answer it in the simplest way. Sort of pick the one thing or two things that you really want to highlight. We'll try to get all the voices here. And let me because, Guy, you were there. You have the closest direct experience of any of us. From your perspective, how would you answer that?
So first, thank you for having me back up here. It's always good to come back to Korbel. Feels like coming home, so thanks. So I'll speak for this one really from more of a sort of boots on the ground military perspective. And I know there's a lot of like bigger institutional perspectives that we'll hear from of why things went wrong. And I think one of the biggest fundamental things, like it actually the biggest thing that shocked me was that anyone in leadership was shocked that things fell apart so quickly. Because I think for anyone who was on the ground, especially engaged in any sort of training of Afghan security forces, or really the nation building side of things, it was very destined and doomed to fail the moment the military pulled out, because we didn't have a robust state and civil society investment in Afghanistan. We relied, we put this idea of nation building and building a military while also building civil society governments really on the backs of 19 to 30-year-old infantrymen, logistics officers, military police. Despite there's a lot of clamoring from military leadership that no, we need investment in the civilian sector. So I think one of the biggest things that this shows is that without that robust civilian sector, it doesn't matter how good tactical success by the military is in these limited pockets. Once you remove that scaffolding, if there isn't that robust civil society to fill it, it is just going to crumble.
So let me take a sort of walk down the line here and sort of get quick snaps from you. What would Debbie, how would you answer that, or what would you add to what Kai said?
So I think I would actually build on what Kai said, and I think, but I would emphasize the contractor angle and what happened with that, because Afghanistan was very much a contractor war. There were more contractors deployed on behalf of the U.S. than troops, and there were far more contractor deaths than troops. As we speak, there are far more contractors than troops that are like dealing with the Taliban leadership, including Afghan contractors. But I think that how that plays into why we failed is that when you parse out by contract security concerns, you're kind of divvying them up. And counterinsurgency, nation building, peace building, whatever you want to call it, is a very intricate set of tasks that requires collaboration, requires a very sort of tight fit between how you exercise violence and what you do with politics. And instead, we divided these things up and gave them to different people. And so like in one example, there was a road that was going to have all kinds of economic consequences, potential connective consequences in the country, and it was built by contractors, essentially guaranteeing their security partly by paying off warlords, some of which were connected with the Taliban. And so we're, in a sense, financing the enemy at the same time that we're sort of building this road. The road, once the payoff stopped, got bombed very quickly, had very little consequence, and the sort of political fallout was highly problematic. And so I think the contractor angle, while it's certainly not central, really affected the way in which an orchestration of this really complicated strategy can move forward in a very detrimental way.
It's so striking to think about the different approach to war of Americans versus the Taliban, who are, hardly had the army of contractors, and we could talk about in more detail the differences in tactics. But David, what would you add to this?
Yeah, when asked what went wrong, I guess the prior question is, what was the U.S. trying to do? And for those of you who watched any of the coverage on the anniversary, and I'm a New Yorker, and I found myself, for better or worse, glued to some of that coverage of the 9/11 attacks. This war was born of fear, absolute fear, deep shock, less than a strategy. It was sort of a given that the U.S. was going to war, it was going to topple the Taliban and go after bin Laden. If you call that the counterterrorism mission, you could argue that it succeeded until now. We'll leave the future aside. People talk about nation building as a mission, but that was really never the mission. There were certainly huge efforts sporadically. But in 2003, the initial US president, G.W. Bush, turned to Iraq. The next president, Obama, announced in 2014 that the US was leaving by 2016, and the two successive presidents, obviously with Biden, implementing that decision. And so, a lot of nation building was done, but not with the kind of leadership and focus or grand strategy that might have enabled it, and who knows whether it could have, but might have enabled it to succeed. And so where the US was left certainly after 2014 and the end of the surge, was keep it stable while planning to leave, which is a very odd, potentially contradiction of missions. And that's, I think, what brought us to where we are.
Right. Andrea.
So I appreciate all these points, and I would add, I think, something that takes us a bit back to the earlier parts of the US time in Afghanistan. I think also picks up on some of what David was saying, which is that the missions kept changing, but I'd also probably like to bring in the kind of education and knowledge angle, and note that particularly in terms of US and maybe Western European scholarship, there's a really big gap. There's lots of scholars of Islam, there's lots of scholars of earlier periods in history who spent time in Afghanistan through the 1970s, but from 1980 on, there was nobody. The same is true of Iraq, the same is true of Iran, and so there was quite a large gap of on-the-ground scholarship, both in terms of a sense of the larger history, which is I think why we got sound bites that some of you may remember, that this has been a space that's been hard to govern since the British tried, or I think in 2004, everybody learned briefly what a Loya Jirga was. But I think also a sense of the more immediate context that Afghanistan, when the Taliban came to power in 1995 and also in 2001, was a place that had undergone 20 years of deeply riven civil and global conflict. And so I think having a sense of not only the history and societal context, but also having a sense of kind of trauma-informed scholarship would have been a more helpful starting point.
Oh, that's very helpful. Naz.
I'll try to build on what my colleagues have set up here, in particular focusing on, I think, David, you made this point very clearly. It's never really clear what the mission was. And I think, Fritz, you kind of had that in your framing, right? What were we doing there to begin with? It was clear that originally we were going in to vanquish a power that had attacked us, right? Then it turned into a counterinsurgency mission. There was a peace-building element, a nation-building element, a state-building element. And as Debbie said, those are all intricate tasks. I would go so far as to say that they're contradictory tasks. And each of those requires a relationship between the international community and a set of Afghan elites that is different. So to do counterinsurgency right, we need to work with the warlords. To do peace building, we should have included the Taliban in an original peace settlement. To do state building, we need a government in Kabul that can project power across the country. And each of those things requires a different set of capacities and a different set of actors to work together. The second thing I'll say is that the Taliban knew all along that we were going to leave, right? And this kind of speaks to Andrea's point. This is a long conflict in which we are a recent actor. And it's the phrase attributed to the Taliban from Mullah Omar on down. It's not clear who really said it. But some Taliban official at some point during a peace settlement negotiation said, "You have all the clocks, we have all the time." They've known for as long as, as long as we've been there, as long as they've been trying to control the country, that they were going to win in the end.
It's so interesting, and building on the point Andrea made, the sense of history, our sense of being able to sort of come in there, the kind of hubris of being able to come in and defeat the Taliban and stand up an army and build a society in a relatively short time period versus a much longer sense of time that the Taliban certainly had. Well, let me bring us, speaking of time, sort of a little bit more to the present, to the events of this year, and a fundamental question that has received a lot of conversation is the question of whether we should have stayed. And so there are those, General Petraeus among them, who argued that we could have stayed indefinitely, should have stayed indefinitely with some limited force, that there was a possibility of, therefore, of maintaining something like the status quo for a rather indefinite period of time. So I'd love to get a couple of takes on that question. Maybe I'll start at the end with you, Naz, and I know you've spoken about this. What's your take on that?
Yeah, and I think it builds, directly on what I was just saying a minute ago. The Taliban have been and had been for at least a decade, and if not more, 15 years since they sort of regrouped around 2004, 2005, laying the grounds for what happened, right? I think, Kai, you're absolutely right. It was a shock at sort of how quickly it happened and how rapidly everything sort of fell apart. But the Taliban had been fighting, and they had successfully gained military control over the country. They had also successfully, I think, convinced, a series of kind of local tribal leaders, local governors, and so on, that, again, the writing was on the wall, and people had sort of come over onto the side of the Taliban before we knew that. And the second thing I'll say is that this was accelerated and I think accentuated by the way that the Trump administration negotiated the peace deal with the Taliban. The fact that the Trump administration and Zalmay Khalilzad, the main peace negotiator, failed to achieve any kind of inter-Afghan settlement was problematic. So the peace deal was between the United States and the Taliban. Where was the Afghan government and other interested Afghan parties in that context?
I ask the same question of you, David, because I think you have a somewhat different take on this. What's your take on whether we could have or should have maintained a force there for indefinitely or for a much longer period of time?
Yeah, I would question this idea of the inevitability of a Taliban victory, but let's just leave that aside. And I've already shared my view that we had these two contradictory missions, stabilization, but under the shadow since 2014 of an intention to leave. Somewhat miraculous to me that it did stabilize to a very significant degree, even to the point where the U.S. went to 10,000 and below in terms of troops, mainly in a training and support mission. The Afghan army continued to fight. But given that this contradiction of goals, which is really unacceptable for an effective strategy, all you can do is, in my mind, is measure the cost of staying, which includes an average of about 15 American troops killed in the years since the mission really shifted to training and stabilization in 2015 after the surge, against the costs we're now beginning to see unfold. The generation of girls, now women, who learned to read and became teachers, professors, politicians, journalists, and all sorts of careers. Millions of girls who went to school. A literacy rate that skyrocketed in that country. A public health system that became functional after Taliban rule, with longevity increasing. You see estimates between 10 and 20 years of increased longevity. Infant mortality cut in half. And you do have to weigh that against the humanitarian catastrophe, which we are likely to see unfold, aside from the punishment or worse of people who supported the U.S. effort, really supporting themselves and their aspirations. The possibility of a complete collapse of the economy with starvation, disease, the flight of refugees on an enormous scale, and ripple effects, aside from the despair of their experience, what that will do in terms of international politics. And I could go on, but given those costs, I would have preferred for the U.S. to continue, even if it was at this sadly distracted, one tiny corner of the U.S. security mind even devoted to it, But the cost of staying versus the cost of leaving, it's a clear call.
I guess the fundamental question is whether that staying in that small numbers was an equilibrium and wasn't a true option. Biden, of course, has argued that was never an option. The only option would be to escalate again. But therein lies the debate, I suppose. Kai,
just very quickly, as Biden points out in his defense, what the Trump negotiation left him with a poor option, and leaving out everything else, the Taliban had promised and honored the agreement not to go after Americans. And yes, there would have had to have been a mini surge of some sort in a difficult phase, but he had no intention of experimenting.
Could I just, I'm sorry, Fritz, you asked me a direct question which I didn't answer, so I'm going to try and answer it now. I just think that the point that you made about the equilibrium is exactly what I would agree with, is that the costs are not static, right? So we may have been able to afford the costs in 2021, and from my perspective, they would have only been increasing over time and kind of kept us in this morass, essentially.
Yeah. I'm curious from a military standpoint, not that you speak for the whole military, but from your experience, where do you land on this question?
Well, I just think one thing to add to David's sort of cost side of this that we have to think about is the international credibility of the United States from a military perspective. And I'm thinking like very individualistic military perspective as well here, where there were lots of promises made to Afghans about the assistance the U.S. would provide for helping the U.S. against the Taliban. And again, this is something that the veteran, the NGO, the journalists communities in particular have been beating the drum on for well over a decade. I'd say 13, 14 years, that the U.S. is incredibly underprepared to handle special immigrant visas, P3 visas, to actually help with the refugee crisis there. And it fell primarily on the backs of veterans, NGOs, and journalists who actually do the work to do this. And I think what's coming out now is we talk a lot about the number of people, and the president is doing a lot of praising of like, this has been one of the biggest humanitarian airlifts in history, all the work that way. Coming out, the vast majority of those still eligible for special immigrant visas are still waiting for special immigrant visas. And so I think if we take one of the costs that isn't really being talked about a lot is, what does integrity mean? And what does it mean when individual service members who honor integrity being something very core to what we say we are, make promises and they're broken politically? And that, I think, is a cost that the U.S. military is going to be living with for a really long time in terms of trust, not just among these sort of training type missions and going in and helping train in unstable regimes and unstable work. I did some field work in Mali earlier this summer, and these similar ideas that are being faced there right now, but with our allies and partners, that NATO is starting to question what it is to partner with the U.S. on this mission. And coming out of the last 4 years, trying to rebuild that international image of the U.S. being a leader, I think this is one of these costs that isn't getting as much attention, is really what does it mean to say that we promise to take care of you, even if it's that we have to leave, we know the Taliban is going to live. What does it mean on this person-to-person level, and where does that integrity come from?
Well, that raises, at least in part, the manner of the exit. And you point out that we've been making promises for a long time, and so even if we were planning to leave, we weren't very well prepared. It seems obvious from the outside to me that this happened much faster than the Biden administration either thought or wished to think it was going to happen. And so I'm curious just to focus on that particular question, sort of how do we make sense of the rapidity of that collapse? What did we miss? Was the intelligence faulty? Was the intelligence there and not listened to? The obvious question is, could we have done this better if we were going to leave? And so I know, Debbie, you've thought a great deal about the role of contractors, and one of the things that's been pointed to is the withdrawal of the contractors sort of left the Afghan army without critical support, right?
Yeah, it's interesting though. I think that's overplayed, to tell you the truth.
Yeah.
I think the thing that we haven't talked about is that the fact that the Afghan government, the president, took a bunch of money and left Afghanistan. the army is not going to stay and fight when the president is
yeah.
taking the money and leaving. And so I think the big issue here for the rapidity of the fall is really the extraordinary political failure and I think that's a lot of our discussion isn't really about that. And I think, I think the contractor angle is interesting, but I think there's a little bit of a different angle that's more interesting to me that, nobody planned for this to be a contractor war. Contractors were just brought in because time after time, it didn't unfold just the way the US expected. And they were like an easy escape valve. And a lot of the contractors in Afghanistan, unlike Iraq, were actually Afghans. In Iraq, a lot of the contractors were third country nationals that came from different countries. But as the US has pulled out, the people that served, as contractors for the US government, for different companies, especially if it was early in the World War, the companies don't even have records of their names. And so you talk about visa requirements and things like that are so incredibly problematic. I've talked to a number of journalists in the last week or two about the issues with just the records that companies, which were keeping records on behalf of the US government. So the US was very unprepared for that. And so it's, I think in terms of our intelligence failure, that's a big question, is what were they paying attention to? When Anthony Blinken said nobody was predicting a fall, why weren't they paying attention to what was going on politically in the country? And maybe our attention is too great on the contractors in the Afghan army and not as much on the politics.
Andrea, maybe I could bring you in on this because I think, I don't know if you could comment a bit about the politics and I guess ultimately the legitimacy of this Afghan government, because as I read the history, there was this enormous optimism circa 2005, elections, this is on its way to a new constitution, on its way to democracy. But, by the end, this was, at least from the outside, widely viewed as corrupt and not particularly legitimate government. So building on Debbie's point, do you have thoughts on that?
Well, I appreciate both those points, and I also really appreciated Debbie's comments. I think that one of the things that I always think about just in teaching is the ways in which the United States today often kind of thinks of American democracy as this thing that has been highly functional kind of from the beginning. And so talking about things like the Articles of Confederation, for example, is often very eye-opening. And so I guess from my perspective, I really appreciate the comment that we need to look at the way that the Afghan government was and ways in which it was and was not functioning and the role that played. I think, unfortunately, as in many complex situations, there's probably not going to be one thing that we point to, that was the moment, that was the 100% turning point. But I also do think that, again, we don't need to go back hundreds of years. We can just go back until the mid-20th century. And again, just look at what Afghans have lived through, right? Some very reform-focused monarchies, but highly coercive, some more corrupt monarchies, still highly coercive, the communist takeover, Soviet invasion, internal warfare, regional warfare, cause célèbre of Middle Eastern governments all around that wanted to send their young unemployed men to fight in the Afghan conflict. And so I'm not 100% sure. I think there's actually a more interesting question about the ways in which the Taliban will or will not be able to claim legitimacy going forward. But I guess we could say that a government could be semi-authentic, semi-legitimate, and also be recognized as corrupt and still be able to hold stability in a certain set of contexts and then still kind of undermine its own case by having some of the main figures flee with pots of cash.
Yeah. So I'm curious, just on the narrow question of the intelligence, aside from having talked to this panel beforehand, what was missed by, as best we can tell, I don't think any of us are in the room, but what, as best we can tell, how good was our intelligence, and to what extent was the administration unwilling to hear what it was being told by the experts? And I don't know, I'm looking at you, David, you might have the closest look on this.
I woke up this morning to watching our Secretary of State being grilled by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And there was Marco Rubio, I happened to catch, saying that, as acting chair of the Intelligence Committee, he had been watching, he said, since January, a stack of intelligence reports, which he couldn't describe in detail, but which all pointed to the rapid collapse of the Afghan military. And Blinken replied, he'd also been seeing these endless reports, and no, they were a complete range from totally rosy to totally dark and everything in between. And it's going to be a long time between what we're seeing now and when we can sort out what was the preponderance of views being seen by the Biden administration. But the deeper question, of course, that's hanging over everyone is that in hindsight, the remarkable question is, why did no one imagine that having had the rug pulled out from under them, you could argue as far back as Obama announcing that the U.S. would leave, but certainly after February 2020 when Trump negotiated the U.S. departure. What kept the Afghan army fighting? They had lost over 60,000 if you include the police, and just kept fighting. And this goes into that category of enormous intelligence failures, where there's a great book by Dick Betts called Surprise Attack. How did the Israelis in 1973, in the face of overwhelming evidence that they were going to be attacked, still get surprised? And I definitely recommend to people this book by Robert Jervis on perception and interception and misperception in international politics, which goes deeply into how belief systems once formed tend to exclude or misinterpret evidence that challenges that belief system. And here, in terms of when it happened, it's kind of like the run on the bank phenomenon. You hear the rumor, and at first it's just a rumor, but then it occurs to everyone. I need to get there first. In this case, it's never going to be won. The U.S. is leaving, and then suddenly it turns into a panic. Why it happened when it did is probably almost unanswerable. To me, the more interesting question in hindsight is, how did they keep fighting for so long?
It's interesting because there's been a tendency, the president has sort of blamed the Afghan arms. They're unwilling to fight for themselves. That's a very different perspective on that. Kai, you want to comment?
Yeah, I think one thing to sort of add on to this of like where some of the surprise came from too, and the intelligence, some of the bias that was formed, again, goes back to some of the way that we sort of, I'll say, fought the war to get there, is that from a broader sort of military structure and strategy perspective, we didn't fight a 20-year war. We essentially fought 21-year wars with the higher turnover, everything from how deployment cycles worked at like the very local level when it comes down to rotating in and out of these villages. And I think to the point that there's a deep, deep history in these places. And if you are there, you can't build relationships in a year, right? People are going to wait it out and say, okay, yep, you're going to rotate, next person to come out. To the broader strategy from a like general officer perspective of just about every year there was the new shiny penny who was rotated in to try to solve the problem, right? That's gonna get you, you'll get your full SARS, you'll retire with great fanfare and go start your consulting business. But when we talk about where some of this cohesiveness of intelligence comes from, it's very hard to build a cohesive picture of what's going to happen if you fight 21-year wars, right? That you're not building on that big cohesive picture where the nuance can really be gained from. You're going to miss things that you're going to see because of how we've actually looked at doing this. And I think that's one of the, if there's a lesson coming out of this, it's that we were so segmented every year in that turnover that it was hard to build a big picture of what might actually happen.
Actually, can I say something?
Debbie,
So just building some on that and some on what Andrea was saying. I've been really interested in, there's been quite a bit of chatter about the fact that we have a lot of Americans talking about the lessons of this war. And in the sort of early versions of that, I started reading more Afghan perspectives on what was happening. There's actually a really good article in the recent New Yorker that's sort of looking at women in the countryside versus in the cities and their feelings about the different governments that have come in. But I think that we had a particular picture of what democracy looks like in Afghanistan that was really probably pretty flawed. And based on, of course, everybody's going to want all of these good things. we actually published a book a couple of years ago and had one of our chapters was on Afghanistan. And it looked at the way that humanitarian groups in Afghanistan would bring to the countryside lots of goods, lots of benefits, women going to school, additional money, things like that. But when asked about minimizing violence, actually they did better without the humanitarian people around, because with that money and with the women going to school, they were targeted more in terms of violence. And so one of the chapters was that people in Afghanistan in the rural areas knew how to minimize violence, but it was ironically not by accepting the humanitarian aid that we were giving them. And I think those kinds of dilemmas are really, really difficult for the intelligence community to get its mind around, especially when it has a really kind of set image of what democracy looks like, good governance looks like. And so I think, in terms of lessons, I think a lot of it should lead us to some self-reflection about how we think about governance in other places versus how people think about it there. Not that everybody in Afghanistan agrees, obviously they don't. The point is understanding more of the perspectives for that place, I think, is incredibly important.
Well, building on that, is the question of sort of what happens in Afghanistan now, and what are the real implications for we have a simple story that we tell, which is this is a unmitigated disaster for Afghans, and particularly for women in Afghanistan. And I'm sort of curious, Andrea, I'm sort of bring you in on this conversation in terms of, how what's a more nuanced take of that? What's your take on sort of on that sort of simple story of this is just a utter disaster for the Afghans, and especially for Afghani women.
Right. I have so many thoughts on this. I will restrict myself in time, but I would actually like to maybe think that we might echo here Kai's question earlier, or points earlier about integrity, and that for those of you who do remember 2001 and the great emphasis placed on the United States coming in to support Afghan women, that is it that the United States only cares about Afghan women for 20 years, and then now we are done, and we no longer care, we are moving on to the next shiny thing? And so I think that also, to Debbie's point, is an opportunity for self-reflection. But I would also say, just again, thinking about the slightly broader context, that one thing that colonial histories have shown us is that the status of women, what to do with women, where they can be, what they can do, what their bodies do, has been a huge ongoing flashpoint for local and foreign actors. And so there's a lot of folks, foreign and local, who really want to say that they have the authority to claim what's appropriate for women, what's best for women. So I think that's one point to note. I would also say that there has been some polling of Afghans. So the Asia Foundation has done some year on year, and looking at the more recent data, a very strong majority rural, so they represent all ethnic groups, et cetera. So 88% as of early February 2021 had strong support for women's rights, women's education, women's leadership. Again, what that looks like in a local context, to Debbie's point, may look quite different from what it looks like in the United States context, as if Americans could all agree on that. So I think that's something we also might want to pay attention to. I think we have seen some feelers, both of the Taliban pushing back at some women's activities and women also self-restricting. I think from my perspective, what I'm really interested to see is what will happen over the course of the next 6 months after the big North American, Western European spotlight moves away. So we see kind of how things shake out then.
So, embedded in your comments is a question of whether this is the same Taliban of 20 years ago, or have they evolved? You see in public statements that we respect the rights of women. Women can go to school, although be it in separate classrooms, and yet at the same time, at least reports of violence against women and violence against former military, et cetera. And so this goes to the whole question, who are the Taliban? How coherent is this? So they can, how capable are they of actually governing now that they've won for now the military conflict? If you have thoughts on that, and I know Naja, you do. So
We probably both have thoughts. So
Okay.
I would just say, I think there's a few different questions in there. I'm not sure we can answer them all right now. The new versus old Taliban conversation, to me, sometimes seems a bit silly because I think there's, again, this kind of American assumption that fundamentalists and extremist groups don't change over time. They do. They may not always evolve towards more progressivism, but they change. And I think that for what we might pay attention to is the way in which the broader context has also changed. So Sunni extremism and Sunni fundamentalism have both evolved considerably over the past 20 years. Sectarianism has evolved considerably over the past 20 years. And so not to advocate for the Taliban, but I hope if they want to survive that they have also continued to evolve because they're dealing in an ongoing, quite a different set of contexts. And I think about that in a whole bunch of different ways, but I'll just say two things. One is that the Afghan population's expectations may be different today. So again, in 1995, Afghans were reeling from 15 years of open war. Now, I think to some of your points, they've had 20 years of some degree of stability, and so the expectations may be higher. And the second is that the Taliban approach is pretty outdated in both extremist and fundamentalist approaches. They want to govern an existing nation state as a national group. Al-Qaeda moved beyond that. ISIS doesn't do that. And so I am curious in terms of the ways that they will continue to manage themselves and portray themselves to Afghans and then also to other regional state and non-state actors.
Yeah.
I would just
No,
build
yeah.
directly from that. I think, Andrew, your point that we don't really know how the Taliban are going to govern yet, and we should wait and see, I think. They are arbitrary, brutish, and nasty at best. And at worst, they're genocidal from the perspective of Shia groups, so the Hazara in the middle of the country, and potentially from the perspective of young women and girls in the country. But we don't know how they're going to govern. And I think that the fact that they're pivoting now from a group, a national group, I think as you rightly characterize them, that has been trying to take control of the capital and is now in power of the capital and trying to govern the country, they are facing an existential challenge. And I think it remains to be seen how they'll sort of adapt to that. I also think the Taliban contains multitudes, right? So we've been hearing a lot about the Haqqani network, the more militant Deobandi strain that has kind of taken some of the powerful cabinet positions. And we know for a fact that there are kind of Taliban, at least affiliated governors out in the country that are actually, intent on actually delivering public services and providing the security and public order that I think Debbie was rightly emphasizing is so important. I was also going to mention the Anand Gopal piece in the New Yorker, where I think we can kind of agree. Of course, Afghans want good things. We all want good things, right? But I think what we're seeing that people want most of all is a sense of physical security and the knowledge that you're not going to have to leave your home in the middle of the night, right? And so if the Taliban can provide around the country more of that sense of physical security than has been possible for the last 40 or 50 years, I think we really have to ask ourselves the question from the international perspective of should we actually want the Taliban to succeed in some ways?
Well, that's an interesting, that's a very interesting, let me pick up on that because, I mean, at the moment, there's a governance challenge that you've articulated, but there's just basic humanitarian challenge. They've lost an enormous amount of aid. There's still, people are not yet showing up at work. Obviously, this is gendered to a great extent. It looks like this is a massive humanitarian crisis, that the government now has to deal with. And so that plays into the question of how can they govern. But then there's a question for the international community, and you see, the UN Secretary General calling us, for massive aid, et cetera. Meanwhile, obviously we're hesitant to do that. But I'm just curious on the panel, sort of what thoughts there might be of what. All right. So what do we do now? Do we now? Can we even get our head around the idea of trying to help the Taliban succeed because it's good for the Afghan people? Are there ways of providing aid that are humanitarian that somehow don't do that? I don't know who would want to take that on.
Well, in phase
David,
one,
yeah,
the Taliban right now have hostages, in effect, right, where the U.S. and our European allies and others, it was a 35-country involvement there. Taliban have enormous leverage in the sense of withholding or letting go people. And in step 2, where, and I saw Blinken this morning, emphasizing, the enormous humanitarian catastrophe and collapse of governance that will face the Taliban unless they play ball with the United States and its allies. But hanging over all of that ultimately is the question you were raising: who are the Taliban now? Are they the same ones who would hang a mother in a filled stadium because she was caught teaching her daughter to read? Or have they evolved? Or are they now in some state of intense and rapid evolution? To me, it's kind of imponderable. And it's another case where intelligence can only go so far, because this is sort of playing out in the minds of Taliban leaders and Taliban soldiers right now under the enormous pressure that they're under. That will, to me, be the ultimate determinant on whether it will be sort of a resumption of counterterrorism in the Taliban seen as associated with the terrorists, or whether they're actually going to turn this corner, which I personally have trouble imagining, but I'm encouraged by what you're saying, Andrew.
I'm struck by both the extent of uncertainty that as you described things, and also in watching Blinken, there's still this reflex, if you don't do this, something bad, so the question is sort of what kind of leverage does the U.S. still have in this context? Guy, I see you shaking your head.
The U.S.
Debbie,
has more than leverage. I mean, the U.S. has, there's a lot, I think that, number one, I think the first thing we should do is actually kind of embrace this uncertainty. We actually don't know. And so I think a much more kind of experimental attitude, as opposed to, we ought to do X, Y, and Z, makes a lot more sense, because the Taliban is a lot of different people. They're paying attention to a lot of different concerns, and we're not really sure what's going to rise to the top. The other thing is paying attention to those that are acting in a more appropriate way and doing what we can to provide support for them, which may not be leverage. It may be a lot of different kinds of tools from a lot of different parts of the U.S., not just the U.S. government. And so I will reemphasize, I think one of the most important things for this moving forward is a lot of self-reflection on the part of not just the U.S. foreign policy establishment, kind of the whole international community foreign policy establishment, about how to think about engaging in a way that's productive with people who are coming at the world from a very different perspective.
Yeah.
And I think that builds or very nicely on what I was thinking too, is that when we talk about leverage, I think we still are stuck in this very Western mindset that leverage is about the fact that we will bring them money, or we will bring them bodies, or we will, that somehow, and then on the other side, that somehow you need the great blessing of the U.S. to be legitimate, right? That somehow is a thing. I think when we're talking about people who carry very different perspectives that are there, what legitimacy is, and I think this conversation we were having earlier, that legitimacy is the fact that they just waited us out, and they're still standing and we're not. So that's a legitimacy in one mind. But then also, I think to some of Debbie's points here, when we start talking about what it is that we can do to support really this humanitarian side of things, and thinking about the greater good, that people want good things, regardless of how they come at it. They want that physical security. They want to be able to take care of their families. They want to be able to eat. They want to be, they want to be able to be educated. These are very basic things. I think we need to start thinking about U.S. leverage very differently, and who those touch points actually are. Because the big national security apparatus type things, whether it's military, state, USAID, whichever it is, none of those are going to defeat what we thought was bad about the Taliban. And that has been proved over the last 20 years, that what we fundamentally thought was bad cannot be defeated by those. So how do we then use what we say are these sort of great values, ideals that we all hold as human beings, to touch point different parts of U.S. society in this? And that where I think somewhere like here, we start talking about educational facilities and scholarships, and what scholars we're actually lifting up so that we have that greater knowledge base that is here, is something that is absolutely essential right now when we are in this real moment of uncertainty.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, I think this conversation really highlights the need for those kind of reflections, for thinking creatively, for all of the things that have been said. We do have the habit of forgetting pretty quickly, and I'm not sure we learn lessons of history very well, but I think that's a challenge certainly for all of us in this world, to do our best to try to tease out, to think through, and to help the public, the wider community, think better about future adventures of this kind. I promised I would get questions from the audience, and so let me do that. I know our time is a little limited here, so and I'm just going to read them. And of course, I don't have my glasses, so that will be a challenge. So the question is, in what ways will the Taliban's connections to China affect its economic and political environment in the next few years? Who would like to take that? Yeah, Andrea.
So I think this is a really helpful question because it helps us look beyond what I think was a kind of bilateral United States-Taliban conversation so far. And I think I am not a China expert, but also not good with microphones. The conversations that I've seen so far have really focused on China kind of coming in, not particularly caring about what the United States is or is not pleased with, and developing their own relationship with the Taliban. However, for folks who look at contemporary Islam, I think we might also consider the discussions of the extent to which there may be Uyghur fighters who have been embedded with the Taliban, which I guess goes back to kind of problematize what I was saying earlier about the Taliban being this kind of very national organization. And so it's not clear, at least from my perspective, whether the Taliban-led government of Afghanistan is going to have a great ally relationship or productive trading, economic relationship with China, or whether they're going to have a much more adversarial one if they aren't able to accommodate, let's say, China's demands for extradition.
That's great. Let me just carry on with other questions, and invite someone else to come on the next one. Although this builds on the conversation we just had, the U.S. seems overly dependent on military force to affect change in particular countries. Are there other possibly more effective ways to cultivate support for things like human rights, women's rights in a country like Afghanistan? So we've been talking a bit about that, but further thoughts on this, Eliza?
I'll take a stab at that. I mean, I think one of the most horrifying headlines I've read on Afghanistan this week, it was a New York Times headline a couple of days ago, was that 1 in 3 Afghans don't know where their next meal is coming from. So I think we have a moral imperative for humanitarian relief and food relief in particular, and it's not just the war, it's the drought and so on and so forth. And I think kind of being more imaginative, and I love the way Debbie put it, being more experimental in terms of how we try to actually assist the Afghan people without necessarily sort of trying to impose our contradictory will on the Afghan government is a way forward on this. The other thing that I think we do have considerable, I don't like the word leverage, but that's what we're talking about, is whether or not Ashraf Ghani left the country with hundreds of millions of dollars, Afghanistan has a balance of payments problem, right? So there's a cold hard cash issue that I think China could easily step in on. And I think there are economic tools that we should be considering more robustly.
That's great. Other thoughts on this? Yes,
I think just as broadly, when we're talking about this, even zooming out from Afghanistan, this is a question, a concern, a problem, a thing we need to look at as, the military has really been pigeonholed as the only U.S. national security instrument of power that can engage in any sort of physical risk. That if there is risk of physical injury, risk of physical harm, and it hasn't always been that way, and I think, but it's been a very recent phenomenon, but we're seeing some of these downsides. So I think another thing that sort of part of the national security conversation, when we talk about reflection, really, when we talk about what it is what is the acceptable level of risk for other instruments of power to be taking? So we talk about cold hard cash problem, food aid in Afghanistan. There are physical risks to going in and actually doing that work, and by relying on the military to do it, that sends a signal around what the militarism is. By hiring contractors to provide that security, again, sends a very different signal about how we're segmenting issues of security, and that human security only exists if you have hard power security with it too. So I think there needs to be a big sort of national security conversation around just that physical risk-taking to do this work. If we're going to invest in humanitarian work, it's dangerous. And we need to understand that as part of what we are doing so that it doesn't become just, oh, well, the military will take care of it, the military will take care of it, the military will take care of it, because then we create these cycles where if that's your only tool, it not only just sort of further divides, I think, civil society, but sends a continued message that if the U.S. does anything, it's militaristic in how it does it.
Yeah, I'm always struck by the kind of the courage of many in the NGO community who, in fact, quite a number have actually stayed and are on the ground. Right? I don't know, Debbie, you think about this a lot.
Right, right. There are a number of people that were kind of slated to leave that decided to stay, and some of them were even interviewed on NPR, and we heard their stories. And so I think that people are, and many of them were talking about the degree to which they have productive relationships with the Taliban. They don't agree with the Taliban, but they have productive relationships with them, which I think is important to pay attention to.
Just in terms of that question, I think there's a great liberal wish, which is realistic in many cases, that more emphasis on foreign aid, on development as an alternative to military force. And there are certainly cases like that. But in a place like Afghanistan, or when the U.S. before Trump left northern Syria, where a quarter of the country was basically under Kurdish control on the ground, but with U.S. support, keeping ISIS out, the Russians out, Assad out, or Iraq, especially after the surge with Petraeus, where there's a twin challenge. There is violence, and there is the need for development and the protection of human rights all together. Yes. And that is the challenge, which I think a lot of people more to the left don't want to face. If violence is there, no, we shouldn't be there. If it's peaceful, that's fine. And I was in D.C. in the early years with this debate with the State Department and the aid people wanting to be more integrated into what the military was doing. But in fact, the military is there, they're improvising. They don't have the expertise to be providing that. They're learning on the ground and sometimes doing great jobs almost accidentally. But until that integration occurs, where you have to understand that development and security, including violence and threat, have to be integrated sometimes.
We have just a tiny bit of time left, so last question. Are the Taliban destined to succeed, or what internal divisions do they face, and will they fail? And on that note,
well, I think
prediction's always dangerous.
I mean, we want them to succeed, right? I mean, what benefit would come from the Taliban falling? You know, if we're sort of worried about all the concerns that we've talked about here, you know, I think that it also would be really useful for us to be experimental, but also to look historically. I mean, we had so many times in the 1990s, you know, the Somalia, you know, not having a government, providing food aid, how well did that work out? You know, I mean, I think that there's a lot that we can learn from our past experiences, most of which would suggest that having a functioning government is better than not. So
it'll be interesting to hear the first American politician who makes that claim that we should want the Taliban to succeed. But the point is very well taken. Naz, you may have the last word.
Okay,
here,
I'll use it to be provocative, which is to say that you can come back in 10 years, and this is a hypothesis, so you can come back and say I was wrong, which is that I think the Taliban has the best chance of succeeding if it moves away from a Kabul-centric strategy, right? That's one of the other things that we kind of took in our image and tried to impose on a country that is, you know, I don't want to say it's ungovernable from the center, but nobody has actually really figured out how to govern Afghanistan from the center, and I doubt that the Taliban will either. And so the question is how much they can actually kind of project their authority, how much they can project public order, public safety around the country, and I don't think that happens from Kabul.
Well, you do have the last word. Please join me in thanking a tremendous panel, really wonderful insights, and thank you all. Thank you for being with us today, and those of you online.